But that's not too far.
That's it. You got, oh, never mind.
What?
I was gonna say, didn't you say you had like 200 words of it? But that was the
No,
last
that's,
time.
yeah.
I remember one.
I'm gonna finish the review article first, because that's like worth more and it's,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's due first. So I'll have to remember to go back and edit it. Print money I even have left. What?
Probably 23.
Wow. I think I might have like 15,
Yeah.
maybe less.
All righty. Welcome to the greatest subject on earth, birds. Yes. Well, you know, how many other classes do you send photos to on a regular basis because you've seen something in the canyon?
Well, it depends. Just kidding.
Yeah,
Find some
okay.
weird subculture growths down there.
Yeah, so, you know, yesterday, you know, she sends me a picture of the kingfisher in the canyon to prove to me that it exists, that it was there. And I got her all excited. I could literally see the drool coming down my computer screen because I actually saw two ravens fly across the quad yesterday. And that was another first for me. There's been 3 campus birds that have appeared here that I've never seen on campus before. So
What's the
pretty cool. The hooded merganser.
Oh,
Yeah, you got a hooded merganser? Daniel had photos of that too. So that's pretty cool. You know, I may have to up the number of required birds because everybody just wants to come here.
It's not the bird's fault.
Oh, yeah.
It's all the
okay,
attention.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, one quick thing that I need to remind everybody about our Tuesday lab attendance is that makeups are fine for excused absences, and as it states in the syllabus, absences to be excused, something you need to clear with me before you do it. It's, you know, I'm happy, you know, if you've got a school activity or you're sick or something like that, you know, it's not an issue, and they're easy for you to make up on your own. But if I haven't heard from you, then the absence is unexcused, and you would not be allowed to make up that field trip. Okay, so I'm pretty liberal with that policy if you've got a good reason, but I do expect you all as best you can to communicate with me ahead of time. You know, now I do get it if you're on your way to lab and you all of a sudden get strucken with an appendicitis or something like that. You know, I won't have you call me instead of 911 or something like that. But you guys get the idea, right? So, okay. Exam next week. I will finish, at least I expect to finish the content today. If for some odd reason I don't, I only have 21 slides left to finish, and so I should get through those today. Then it will be just the very beginning of next Tuesday, but I will get it done. And then we will start our chapter on behavior after that. Yes, Michelle.
So the exam is going to be Friday again, right? But are we going to have class Thursday?
No,
Okay.
nice.
I always give you a day off for the exam. So, you can come if you want, though. Yes, Sylvia.
So is that next Friday?
That, unless you want to come during spring break.
No.
She's thinking about it.
I already have a developmental virus.
Well, we're just gonna celebrate it. It's okay.
Well, Sylvia, if you would prefer to take it on Thursday, talk to me and we can probably make an arrangement.
I will think about it.
That's exactly what I thought. So, anything else? Yes.
On the syllabus, it says that we need to submit topics for the final presentation. Do we still need to do that by tomorrow, or?
Is it on for tomorrow?
That's what I think. Maybe I read it wrong.
No, I think I saw that too.
Yeah, it's not
Did you?
Thursday.
Yeah, you know, because I'm basically doing Canvas as we go. Those things are not in front of my face as they typically are. I am okay with them not coming by tomorrow, but let's get them in before spring break. Fair enough. I'm sure that you're all not going to run out and start recording a bunch of songs before then. And by the way, if anybody is planning on doing some song recording next week, set up a time with me and I'll teach you how to use all the stuff, since we have not done it in class yet. And I may just opt to do that with individual groups because I'm a little bit behind. Which is all your fault, but that's a good thing because you guys ask good questions.
I'd love to be involved in one of the song groups if anybody wants the fifth wheel.
There you go.
I won't slow you down, I might speed you up.
Thank you.
Anything else? All right, let's do it. Because we get to talk about navigation today, which is really cool. Oops, that's not what, I almost messed it up again. Share screen.
I don't really care actually, so, but
You'd think, as often as I have done this over the last 2 years,
yeah.
that remembering,
Well, oh, yeah. You know, the sunshine.
and Maddie's not listening to a word I'm saying. Right?
No,
No.
no, not now.
Okay. All righty. And so Maddie, since Maddie doesn't need my instruction, she's going to take the exam tomorrow.
Yeah, sure. It's terrible. Whatever.
I know. What the heck? Okay, migration. So, how high do birds fly? That's been burning on your brain for like weeks, right? Well, often altitudes during migration are going to be chosen based on wind. So remember last time we talked about birds catching trade winds, going out over the Atlantic, catching a trade wind to be, you're going to distract me to death, Maddie. I want you to know that. That's okay. Take a big drink of whatever's in your cup and relax.
Okay.
Okay. Where was I? Okay. So remember last time we talked about birds that fly out to the Atlantic and then catch these trade winds to be blown down to South America, and that this can provide them some substantial energetic savings with regard to the cost of flight during migration. But there is quite a bit of variability with regard to how high birds fly. One problem that birds have when they fly at higher altitudes, it's the same problem for birds that have if they are moving up in elevation just to kind of live on a mountain someplace. And that is they have to deal with colder temperatures and lower oxygen density in the air. So they're going to have higher thermal regulatory costs, and they're going to have to move. They have to breathe more air to get the same number of molecules of oxygen through their lungs. And so birds have some adaptations to deal with these sorts of things. So here are some examples. Songbirds, so passerines, they generally are going to migrate at altitudes below 2,000 feet, 610 meters. Okay, not very high. And when you look across all migratory species, 90% of them will not migrate higher than 6,500 feet, which is about 2,000 meters in elevation. So for the most part, these are not excessively high altitudes for migration. Okay. Now, there are some exceptions to this. Birds that are crossing large bodies of water often tend to fly at higher elevations. One of the reasons for this potentially is, well, there's a couple of potential reasons for this. One is that they may be able to catch cleaner wind when they're at higher elevation. Another potential advantage is that when the air is less dense, that's going to reduce the amount of drag. Now that also means you're going to have to work harder to produce lift, but maybe the trade-off is favorable for that when you're having to fly a long distance. Now there are some birds that actually routinely fly at pretty high elevations. Shorebirds, for example, it's not unusual for them to fly as high as 15,000 feet. Okay, which is nearly 4,600 meters. So that's pretty high. And one of the things we'll see in a couple of slides is shorebirds also fly pretty fast. Okay, and so so they do a couple of things that are a little bit different, but that's a pretty high elevation. Daytime migrants in general will fly at lower elevations than nocturnal migrants. Have no idea why that happens. But one possibility for this is one of the methods that birds will use for navigation is just to look at landmarks. And so perhaps being at lower elevation allows them to better see landmarks during the day when they're flying and migrating. Really high migration will occur when birds have to fly over like big mountain ranges. So the champion in this regard is the bar-headed goose, which flies over the Himalayas, which puts them near 28,000 feet, which is 8,500 meters. That means, you know, when you're on Alaska Airlines, you can look out the window and they're going to wave to you. Okay. You would not survive that altitude.
No.
So not only because there's like no oxygen for you there, but also it's really cold. So, okay. So anyway, again, these birds that fly at really high elevation have some amazing adaptations that allow them to do that. So let's look at a few of the adaptations that have been studied in the bar-headed goose that can fly, you know, like as high as an airline jet. So they have actually a slightly larger wingspan and lower wing loading than other geese that are in that typical size range of the bar-headed goose. So one adaptation is lower wing loading. So it makes it a little easier for them to fly at those higher altitudes. Their flight muscles have better circulation than what you would typically see in waterfowl. So the flight muscles are going to be perfused with more blood. So more oxygen is going to be delivered to the flight muscles, which means they can deal with the, that's one adaptation for dealing with the lower oxygen density at that altitude. They actually have larger lungs than typical waterfowl, which means they can move more air. In hypoxic conditions, they can hyperventilate, and they use the term hyperventilate here, but I often wonder that's really a good word for a bird, considering the unidirectional flow of air through their lungs, but that's the word people use. Anyway, they can breathe more quickly, 7.2 times faster than their breathing rate at SeaWorld. Yeah, at sea level, and suffer no ill effects. And the reason why this study really points this out is because when you breathe rapidly, you tend to blow off a lot of CO2, which actually can trick your body into thinking that it has no oxygen depth when it really does, because your body is primarily monitoring CO2 levels to control breathing rate. And what this can do is when you blow off CO2, it can raise your blood pH. Okay. But the bar-headed goose does not seem to have to deal with this kind of a problem. I don't know. I don't know I honestly don't know how they avoid blowing off CO2, because I mean, that is just a physical thing that with regard to membranes, but they don't seem to deal with the problem. Oh, because the geese are big enough where they can probably put instrumentation on them and measure that sort of thing, and that includes blood gases. Okay, where was I at? Okay, cardiac output increases 5 times over what it would be at sea level at rest. So they, again, another adaptation to move a lot of blood. And then the last one is that their hemoglobin has the capacity to really emphasize the loading of oxygen when they breathe. And so for those of you who haven't had physiology, you know, the affinity of your hemoglobin for oxygen changes depending on where it is in the body, okay? When it's in your lungs, it is really sticky for oxygen. It likes to pick the oxygen up so that it can, you know, kind of saturate all of it with oxygen and carry it out to the body. But when it gets to the body, then it actually becomes less sticky for oxygen and wants to dump that oxygen so that it can be available to tissues. And this is all actually managed in part by some shifts in pH and some things like that. But the bar-headed goose can actually make their hemoglobin really sticky for oxygen, which means that they can increase the efficiency with which they extract it from that low oxygen density air. So it's another adaptation. So you can see there's a whole bunch of adaptations that this species of goose has that allows it to fly at that real high elevation. And we haven't talked about thermal regulatory adaptations, because they got to be able to tolerate that too. But you know what? They're a goose, so they're full of goose down, and maybe that's all it takes. Questions at this point? Anybody ever eat goose? Have you ever thought about all these adaptations when you ate goose? Probably not. Okay, so we've talked about elevation and adaptations for migrating at different elevations. Let's talk about flight speeds. Okay, so interestingly, I think it's interesting anyway. During migration, most birds fly pretty slow, in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 miles per hour. That may not seem like slow to you because you probably can't run that fast, but for a bird, that's pretty slow. 32 to 48 kilometers per hour. All right. Why would a bird choose to fly slow?
Uses less energy.
Huh?
Does it use less energy?
It does use less energy. Go ahead.
Less drag.
Well, it depends on what kind of drag we're talking about. Because remember, profile drag actually increases with airspeed, but induced drag decreases with airspeed. So what is the shape of the power curve for flight look like? Can you all remember that? I know it's been a few weeks. I didn't get the sign language.
I remember.
Okay, just say it. It's U-shaped. It's U-shaped. There you go. And so if you think about it, remember we talked about the minimum power consumption speed, and we talked about the maximum range speed, which is it costs a little bit more, but you get more bang for your buck in terms of distance. Okay. Would it not make sense if you really wanted to conserve energy that you would be flying at that maximum range speed? And that's likely what particularly these passerines are doing, because flight for them is not energetically efficient anyway. And so by flying at this speed, they get more energetic bang for their buck. Waterfowl and shorebirds fly quite a bit faster, so 30 to 50 miles per hour, try running that fast, or 48 to 80 kilometers per hour. Now, why would waterfowl and shorebirds fly faster? Another brain teaser for you.
They have
Go ahead, somebody.
higher wing loading.
They do have higher wing loading. So, so how does that relate to them flying faster?
They need to like get more lift and going faster through the air.
That's actually correct, yes. Now remember, now when we're talking about waterfowl here, primarily talking about like diving ducks. And what kind of wings do diving ducks and waterfowl, or not, or pardon me, shorebirds have? They do have a higher aspect ratio wing. What's it shaped like? See, this pure evidence you hang on every word I tell you in this class.
Long and narrow,
Huh?
long and narrow.
They are long and narrow. Yeah,
They're elliptical.
no, they're not.
Aren't they pointed?
They're pointed. Yeah. So remember, they're what we called high-speed wings. Okay. And so they can produce lift efficiency when you're moving at a good clip. And so these birds are moving at a good clip because it is going to maximize the amount of lift that they're able to produce with this style of wing. Okay. So back to passerines for a moment. During migration, okay, so in the spring, their migrations move really, really fast. But in the fall, not so much. They migrate quite a bit more slowly in the fall. And one of the things that really speeds up the migration is just shorter stopovers. Remember, we talked about stopovers last time. Okay. And they'll actually make longer flights between stopovers during the spring. Why would spring migration, why would birds, why would selection favor a longer spring or a shorter spring migration? Yeah.
Because there's more food when they get there faster and more nesting grounds.
Exactly. So the prevailing thought on this is that spring migration tends to be faster because the sooner you get to the breeding grounds, the sooner you can get to reproducing and take advantage of the large amount of food that's available on the breeding ground. Because remember, one of the things that made migrants less reproductively successful than a temperate resident was the fact that they just weren't on these really good breeding grounds for a very long period, for as long a period of time. Okay, so passerines again, they generally migrate using short, relatively short flight. So a short flight for them might be 200 miles between stopovers, 320 kilometers. If they don't have to cross any sort of big barrier. Now, if they're crossing the Gulf, which a lot of birds do, then of course the duration of their flight is going to be longer than that. But when they are over land, they'll make short stops. And this is something you would expect from passerine because again, with those elliptical wings, they got to flap all the time. Flight costs are going to be higher, and so they're going to burn through their energy reserves more quickly. So being able to stop and refuel, and they'll usually park themselves at a stopover for 2 or 3 days so that they can really fatten up again before the next leg. That makes sense for those sorts of birds. On the other hand, when you talk about waterfowl and shorebirds that are flying fast, they're flying really long distances. They can go almost 2,000 miles in a single day, 3,000 kilometers. Okay, or in as little as 2 days. And they're trucking. You know, they are moving quickly in order to keep their lift production efficient. And they also tend to be larger, so they can probably carry a little more fat than these smaller birds can. Their basal metabolic rates are going to be a little bit lower. Thermal regulation is going to be a little less challenging for them. So it's probably a little easier for them to travel long distances. All right, questions? All right, navigation. So how do birds who are taking off from south or Central America figure out how to get back to that very same nest that they used last year. Okay, this has been studied intensely for a long, long time. When we look across the entirety of studies that have been done on bird navigations, they will range on looking at anything from sensory mechanisms, basically to just rote memory of migratory routes. And as we shall see before we get done with all of this, there is a real integration of methods that birds use for navigation. And navigational information, the techniques that birds use for navigation are going to produce some very, very specific information for them that will allow them to precisely find the location where they need to be. Some birds will return to a specific tree and even a specific nest after spending the winter thousands of miles away. And I guarantee if I plopped any one of you in the middle of the Amazon somewhere and said, see you later, no, I wouldn't. because your navigation abilities wouldn't be quite so good. Now, John James Audubon, okay, and a zillion things been named after him. He drew pictures of birds, studied a lot of birds, was an old-time birder, which means no birder existed without a shotgun, because that's how you got your birds to study them. They weren't released. Anyway, he trapped an eastern phoebe in his yard. And this is an eastern phoebe right here, tied a little piece of silk thread around its leg. This is an early version of bird banding, and found that it returned to his house the next spring. A little simple experiment, and he was amazed by this. Really good navigation ability. Some experiments on shearwaters and sparrows, and I'll show you an example of an experiment with sparrows in the next slide. They have been shown to be able to return home after being transported thousands of miles away, stuck on an airplane and flown thousands of miles away, then released. They get back home. Here's an example of that. Okay, yet another study of white-crowned sparrows. So some white-crowned sparrows were collected in San Jose, California. They were flown by airplane, some to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, others to Laurel, Maryland. And what happened to these birds? These birds ended up making it to their nesting grounds, following these blue lines right here, all the way up here. And then, after spending the summer up here, went back to San Jose. They figured it out. Which tells you that these birds have to have some really good navigational tools in order to get back to where they need to be when they were taken someplace that they had never been to before. Pretty cool. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to walk through several different types of mechanisms or techniques or protocols or whatever you want to call it, mechanisms that are used for navigation. The simplest, of course, would be visual landmarks. Okay, and visual landmarks have been shown to be used by birds both for local movements as well as long distance migrations. So both diurnal and nocturnal migrants, so birds that migrate during the day or during the night, they often will follow rivers and coastlines, that are just kind of natural road maps to get them from point A to point B. Interesting thing about birds in general, particularly passerines, is they are reluctant to cross large bodies of water. They will do it when there's not a lot of option or when the cost of avoiding it is high. But they just as soon not do it. And so you know, the way migration routes are used by birds, you know, following a coastline or river, a lot of times what will happen is that it will funnel birds to this specific point. And Cape May, New Jersey is a classic example of this. Birds will funnel this point right here, then have to cross this little bit of water right here. Okay, it's a relatively narrow place for them to cross. And so it's a real popular place to go find birds because they're all just being funneled to that point before they jump across the barrier. And I've listed a couple of others here that kind of fall into that category. But this is a consequence of following these natural landmarks, these coastlines or rivers or whatever. All right. The next strategy that birds will use, or the next method that birds will use to navigate, is using what we call the solar compass. They track the sun. And the experimental demonstration that birds use a solar compass was done clear back in the 1950s. And there were some classic experiments that were done both on starlings and pigeons. So Kramer, in the early 1950s, studied starlings, probably because they were easy to get. Okay. And what he found is when the starlings were placed in a circular enclosure, and there are some migratory populations of starlings, that when they could see the sun, when they exhibited migratory restlessness, it was always to the northeast, which was the correct migratory direction. Okay, and I'll show you a visual of the data from this experiment in the next slide. Okay, Matthews in the 50s and 60s studied pigeons. And what he found is when you took a pigeon and released them in a location that wasn't familiar to them, when they could see the sun, they found their way home. Okay, when it was cloudy, they had a much more difficult time. Again, indication that they were navigating by the sun. Now, another thing that Matthews did was that he repeated these experiments at different times of the day. And as you know, the sun is in a different place in the sky at different times of day. And he found that as long as they could see the sun, it didn't matter what time of day. They could still find their way home, which meant that these pigeons have the capability of correcting for the different positions that the sun will have in the sky at different times of day. Pretty amazing, isn't it? All right, so here are some visuals of the experimental results for the starling work. So we'll look at the images here on the left. So here's the circular enclosure. Northeast is out here. The sun is available. The bird's migratory restlessness was always focused in this direction. But when there's no sun, it's just kind of random around the enclosure. Again, sun was important. Here's an experiment that I haven't described to you yet, but is really kind of fascinating. So on just a normal day when the birds could see the sun, they would get restless in a direction that was correct to go find food. So always going that way, okay? Now, this is important. And I believe Kramer did this study as well. What he did was he took the birds into the lab and time shifted them. So using artificial lights, shifted their clock so that it was off by 6 hours. And so if you look what happens then, when he repeated the experiment, the birds misinterpreted the solar compass and it threw their direction off by 90 degrees. Okay. Keep that in your brain, because it gets even better. All right, so there are two hypotheses, two competing hypotheses as to how birds use a solar compass. The first is what's called the sun arc hypothesis. And in the sun arc hypothesis, birds are going to determine both position and direction from the sun's arc. The other hypothesis is what's called the map and compass hypothesis. What the map and compass hypothesis says is that position is determined by some sort of map. That map may just be visual landmarks. It could be, any number of things. But it is something, it's not the sun's arc. Then direction is determined using an independent compass based on the sun or potentially even the magnetic field. We'll get to the magnetic field later. All right, so the question is, which is it? So here we've got an image of an experiment here, and I've put directions up around this so that you could follow along. If the sun arc hypothesis is correct, and to test this, they had to time shift the birds again, like they did in the Starling experiment. So what they did is they time shifted the experiment by 6 hours, meaning that we're going to get that 90-degree error in interpretation of where the sun is. Now, this is a clever experiment because the direction at which that 90-degree shift goes can tell you which one of these hypotheses is correct. So if the sun arc hypothesis is correct, then if the sun is high in the sky, so it's noon somewhere, your internal clock is shifted by 6 hours, and so it's just 6 hours earlier. You're thinking it's dawn somewhere. And so when you see the sun, that means, boy, you're a whole lot farther east than you thought you were. Okay, because if it's 9 a.m. here, it's noon somewhere east of here. Okay, so you think you're east. Because remember, the sun arc hypothesis gives you both direction and position. All right, so so this here represents the normal bird that's not time shifted. So it's in the south, its loft is in the north, it's going to fly north. That's what it wants to do. So for the sun arc hypothesis, it thinks it's east because its internal clock says it should be in the morning. But so what it has to do, so it thinks it's east. So in order to go north, it needs to fly 90 degrees to the right of the sun. And we're talking about facing the sun, so it's actually looking that way. And so it wants to. This is where it should go. It thinks it has to go here because its clock is off, and so it will fly 90 degrees to the right. Does that make sense to everybody? Because the next one is the one I screw up every year. And so you guys are going to have to help me keep on the straight and narrow with this. All right. So that's the sun arc hypothesis, pretty straightforward. The map and compass hypothesis, there's a lot of stuff that goes on here. So the map says that the bird is south, okay? It's going to interpret the map just like this bird that's not time offset would. Okay, because it's using something other than the sun to determine its position. Okay, its internal clock says it's dawn. Okay, remember, it's offset by 6 hours. But the sun's high in the sky, so it still thinks it's dawn. But his sun compass says that the sun is in the east. Now, the thing that's different between sun arc hypothesis and the map compass hypothesis is the bird does not think it's east because its position is based on its map. Does that make sense? Okay. So it thinks the sun is in the east. So, and I think I'm going to get it right. In order to go north to its loft, it has to go it's going to fly 90, it's going to go to the left of the sun. So that 90-degree turn is going to be to the left of the sun rather than to the right, as it was in the sun arc hypothesis. Does that make sense? Because if you're looking east, north is left, right? Are your heads dizzy yet? Which do you think is right? I think I put Sylvia to sleep back there.
Sitting here.
Which do you think is right?
Was it the diagram? Or does that picture show the results, or is that the hypothesis?
Those are the hypotheses. It even says hypothesis.
Oh, sorry, small print. Bad vision.
How many vote for sun arc?
I hope it's that one.
That means most of you think it's map compass? Map compass wins. Birds never do something the simple way, right? So the map compass hypothesis has been shown to be the way the birds do this. So they're actually using multiple. Do you think there's any advantage to that? I heard a very, yes.
Yeah, I think there's an advantage because the more things that you use to tell direction, the more accurate it will be. Most likely.
And you know what? That's going to be a theme that plays out as we go forward. Yeah. So anyway, map compass from this experiment has been shown to be the way it works. All right. But if you are a nocturnal migrant, you can't use the sun, right? Not unless you've got vision that can see through the earth or something like that. So birds that migrate at night actually navigate by the stars. What's really cool about this is all the experiments that they have done with this, they get to do them in planetariums. You go release a bunch of birds in a planetarium, or they have some other way of simulating night skies. But the experiments are cool, right? So things that weren't known about stellar navigation is whether or not they are actually tracking the movement of stars in a similar manner to how birds track the movement of the sun. And stars, you know, sun is a star. But being able to precisely interpret star position during nighttime migration is going to be particularly important for migrants that particularly like cross the equator, because what your night sky looks like totally changes. And so you got to be really good. And there are a lot of birds that do cross the equator when they migrate. Okay, remember Emlyn and the indigo buntings? We've talked about him before. Well, he did a lot of really good work with regard to nighttime migration, because indigo buntings migrate during the night. And so what he did is he developed this method where he put the birds in a funnel where they couldn't see out the sides, but they could see out the top, so they could see the stars. And then he stuck an ink pad in the bottom of the funnel right here. And so when the birds got restless, in other words, they were experiencing Zugenruth, they would leave ink stains on the side of the funnel where their feet were kind of scratching on it while they were being really active, while being restless. And here you can see what that would look like. Okay, the bird clearly was active in this direction here. And then he exposed the birds to either natural or simulated night skies. And during the spring, the birds oriented to the north, and during the winter, they oriented to the south, the direction that they needed to travel. But he didn't stop here. Actually, here, I'll show you actually a photograph of his experimental setup here so you can see what it looks like. But here is some visualization of some of the manipulation that Emlyn did in these experiments. So A is the natural sky. All right, so pretty much north. Simulated night sky, same deal, pretty much in the same direction. Why is it important to do both a natural and simulated night sky? Go ahead, Maddie.
To see if there's some other like factors involved in more than just looking at the stars.
What do you mean by other factors?
I don't know what the other factors are, but I feel like you would do a simulated one because you're like, okay, is this exactly the thing that they're using? So you can be sure.
So you're in a very complicated way. You're saying that he did this experiment to demonstrate that he could use simulated night skies to do this experiment. Cool. That was brilliant. Okay, and so the simulated night skies do work. And so then he shifted the simulated night sky 180 degrees, and look what happens. The birds now think north is south. And then when no stars were visible, look what happens. They're active in random directions. So there is no directionality to their response. So clearly the birds are trying to track the stars here. So then Emlyn went on and he was trying to figure out what is it about the stars that are used by these birds when they are migrating. And his first hypothesis was, well, these birds are all going to orient on the North Star because it's a fixed point in the sky. All right. So he tested this by blocking out various stars, including the North Star. And what did he find? They didn't use the North Star, but instead they used a series of constellations that were within 35 degrees of the North Star. Wouldn't this make it more complex? Can you think of a good reason why this might be a better strategy than just tracking the North Star? Yeah, go ahead.
If there's clouds in front of the North Star, they can use like other.
Yeah, I mean, it provides you redundancy. Okay, it provides you some redundancy, and here are some of the constellations that they use. But this redundancy is important because how often do you have a perfectly clear night sky? There's a lot of nights where you have clouds moving around. And if you can base your navigation on more than one structure in the sky, then that's going to give you an advantage. Emlyn also did a couple of other things in his work. You know, he did some more photoperiod work, which we've talked about before, but he was able to prepare birds for either a north or southbound migration just basically by changing the photoperiod. And just so he could illustrate that migration is at least in part under physiological, i.e. hormonal control. Questions at this point? Okay, so we've looked at visual landmarks, we've looked at a solar compass, we've looked at a stellar compass. Now let's talk about olfaction. Can birds use smell to navigate? So for a lot of seabirds, particularly petrels, and even it's been suggested for pigeon, they seem to have some ability to use odors to find their specific nests. So Leach's storm petrel, that's this guy right here. When they return from a feeding foray at sea, they will always approach their nesting location downwind to pick up the scent. And then the scent can lead them precisely to where their particular nest happens to be. Okay, so in this case, nest location, the precision of nest location was detected by smell. It had been suggested that homing pigeons used smell a lot to help them navigate. But when you look across all the experimental results, the results are pretty mixed. And so there's a lack of clarity as to whether or not odor can be used for long distance migration. The prevailing wisdom for this is that olfactory is pretty much supplementary. And it's just kind of going to be kind of a fine tuning thing, and most likely going to be important only for some very localized sorts of navigation. Okay, the next, the geomagnetic compass, geomagnetism. Okay, so you remember when we talked about cryptochromes? Keep those in your brain for a second. So the Earth's geomagnetic field allows birds to place themselves horizontally in space. And this is because the strength of the magnetic field changes with latitude. Okay, and that's what I just said. Okay, because the intensity of the magnitude or the intensity of magnetic field changes with latitude, you basically can know how far north or south you are. So they first did studies that demonstrated that birds can use geomagnetism to navigate back in the 1960s. A really classic experiment done on European robins. And what they did is they put European robins in a cage, and they created a magnetic field where they basically kind of reversed the polarity of it. So they changed the direction of it. And it totally reversed the bird's orientation with regards to migratory restlessness. And so this was the first experiment that clearly demonstrated that the birds could do this. Studies done on homing pigeons. They would put magnets on their heads. And they found that when on cloudy days, when the sun was not available, that the birds lost their ability to navigate. Because the magnets screwed up their ability to sense the magnetic field of the Earth. And here are some visualizations of some of these experiments. So they ran pigeons that have just pieces of brass and some that had magnets on it. On sunny days, they migrate. It didn't matter. They both migrated in the same way. So they were using primarily the solar compass. But on overcast days when they couldn't see the sun, the birds that just had the little pieces of brass on them were able to navigate correctly using the geomagnetic compass. Whereas the birds with the magnet on them were going in random directions. So this showed two things. One, that the importance of the geomagnetic compass to navigation, and two, the fact that these birds actually have a backup plan for navigation. You know, if your primary plan is the solar compass and you have an overcast day, you don't have to stop moving because you can fall back on your geomagnetic compass. So the tools used for navigation, it's an integrated set. Now, we know that many migratory birds, frankly, if not all of them, use geomagnetism, and that geomagnetism is sent via specialized photoreceptors in the visual system. Remember we talked about those cryptochromes, those flavoproteins? Those what? Okay, that are deposited in the retina. Gosh, my brain's older than all your guys's, and I remember that. Okay. Those flavoproteins allowed the birds to be sensitive to the geomagnetic field. And so that's what they're talking about right here. Here's another cool experiment. It involves what's called a Helmholtz coil. And the Helmholtz coil is basically some wrapped wires that they make a little kind of a little helmet or hat out of for the bird. And then they run a current through it. Okay. Scared her off?
No, she had enough.
Anyway, so when they can do this, they can do experiments with this in using very much the same sort of techniques that they did with the European robins, where they move these artificial magnetic fields. When they move it clockwise, the birds are able to navigate just fine. Sunny days, they go in the right direction. Overcast days, they pretty much mostly go in the right direction. When they orient it counterclockwise, on sunny days, they go in the right direction. But on cloudy days, most of them are oriented 180 degrees in the opposite direction. So they get good information from their solar compass. They get bad information from or incorrect information from their geomagnetic compass. Yeah.
What's the difference between this experiment and the last one with the magnet and the brass? Seems very similar.
So this one here, they're actually feeding geomagnetic information to the bird. Okay, so that's what they're doing with this artificial magnetic field right here. For the one with the magnets are actually disrupting the natural geomagnetic information.
Got it. Okay.
And the difference is you'll see that in this case, when they turn the geomagnetic compass in the wrong direction, it offsets their directionality by 180 degrees. Whereas the magnet, they just moved randomly because they had no information. Does that make sense?
Also, one more question. How come they somewhat got it correct when it was in the counterclockwise? I would think that like they would both just be 100% off. Does that make sense?
Probably, my best guess for that is that these are probably not perfect simulations of the Earth's geomagnetic field. And there's probably some variability between birds in their ability to use the geomagnetic field. That would be my guess, but you should take that as speculation because I have no evidence. One of the things that we will see is that the geomagnetic field is almost totally genetically based. Okay, so the quality of your genetics could impact your ability to use it. Whereas the solar compass is something that it's got a genetic component, but using it well is something birds learn. Okay, I think I already said that. All right, so navigational ability of birds, it's partially innate genetics and it's partially learned. One of the things that you will see, if you go out and chase down rare birds enough, is that a large proportion of birds that are reported outside of their normal range, these extraliminal records, we call them, a lot of times they are young birds because they have not really honed their navigational skills yet. Okay. And so young birds tend to get lost more than older birds do. Okay. The timing of migration certainly has, and it is genetically based. We know this because of the fact that birds get restless in captivity. So there are some physiological signals that tell them that they need to do this. Some experiments which have been done to illustrate this are are experiments that have been done, a lot of them with warblers, where they have found that birds that have longer migrations tend to exhibit Zuganru in captivity for longer periods of time than birds that have shorter migrations. And so 2 examples of this, the willow warbler, this guy right here, which migrates for up to 4 months, exhibits Zuganru in captivity for 4 months. Another bird, the Eurasian chiffchaff. I have no idea who decided to name that bird. That's this guy right here. They migrate for up to 2 months. But in captivity, their Zuganru lasts for 2 months. So there's a real tight correlation. And we look at this graph right here. We basically have the duration of captive Zuganru on the y-axis here, and then migratory distance on the x-axis. And you can see there's a pretty tight linear relationship. So this is good evidence that, that Zuganru is under genetic control. That doesn't mean that the tools for navigation are all strictly under genetic control, but the urge to migrate is. So to illustrate that use of things like the solar and stellar compass have a pretty significant learned component to it. Indigo bunting. So we're back to some more of Emlen's work. When they are raised under different night skies, it will change how they navigate using the stars. So if a bunting is raised under a normal night sky that rotates around the North Star, they orient properly. They track their constellations properly, exactly what they're supposed to do. But Emlen did some experiments where he raised buntings where the night sky rotated around a different star, Betelgeuse. They named a movie after that star. Okay. And the birds that were raised under that night sky adopted a navigational strategy that followed the movement of the constellations around Betelgeuse. So if you were to let them go, they would not get to where they thought that they were going. But it was clear evidence that the birds actually had to learn how to use a stellar compass. All right, some more experiments and some fun experiments that illustrate genetic control of migration have been done with hybrids. So hybridizing birds from migratory and non-migratory populations of the same species. So here we have some European warblers, and they are migratory in Germany. They are non-migratory in Africa. And so what they did is they looked at the level of Zuganru, non-migratory, migratory, and hybrid forms of this are illustrated when they were in captivity. And you can see here the African or the non-migratory warblers had hardly any. The migratory German warblers had a whole bunch, and the hybrids were like smack dab right in the middle. So clearly, clearly there is a genetic basis for this. So in a separate study, okay, that involved black caps from a partially migratory population. So a partially migratory population where you had some individuals that were migratory, some that were not, but they were all in the same populations. What they did is they did experiments to where they isolated the young from migratory parents from the young of non-migratory parents, totally separated them so that when those young grew up and reproduced, they would only reproduce basically with their own kind. So migratory females were only going to reproduce with migratory males, and non-migratory females were only going to reproduce with non-migratory males. And what they found is they were able to build fully migratory and fully non-migratory populations in 4 to 6 generations. So again, real strong evidence that the urge to migrate is innate. Yes.
So you just mentioned like, so the urge to migrate is genetic, but I remember you talking about this last week, how a lot of birds will follow like traditional migration paths, even when it doesn't make sense, because that's what like their ancestors did. So does that navigational aspect also have a genetic component because of that?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. And it would, the answer to that is I don't know. And because you could make a case for either. Presumably the offspring of these birds that populated Siberia, these pectoral sandpipers, okay? The offspring probably would follow their parents on migration. So you could argue that that's learning, okay? But you could also argue that, you know, there's got to be a strong urge to go that way. So I don't know which it is. If I had to guess, my feeling is that they probably go that way because they actually learn it from their parents, because they all got to migrate at the same time. And there was no history for them to go any other direction. Anything else? I think this, oh, I got one more slide. Okay. The last point that I want to make with regard to migration is that all the migratory tools in the world are not useful really in understanding what's going on in the environment around you. Okay, with the possible exception of if you really depend on the solar compass and it's cloudy a lot, you know, that may provide you some information. But there are practical things that are necessary during migration that can cause migration to be finely tuned in terms of timing, maybe even the direction that you travel. Food availability is a potentially big one. These factors are probably going to be most important in the short term. So when you hit a leg of migration where maybe something environmentally is not right, maybe you extend your stopover, maybe, you know, you fly a little bit, you know, to the north or a little bit to the east, a little bit to the west, to take some slightly different route in order to avoid some sort of an extreme condition. So some fine tuning is going on. These alterations that are required to fine tune your the migratory event is something that has to be learned. This is not a genetic sort of thing. A young bird is more likely to make a mistake in this regard than an older bird that's done this a few times. And I mentioned this earlier, the geomagnetic compass is largely innate. Birds are born with the ability to use the geomagnetic compass. But the solar compass or the stellar compass, those are things that they have the ability to do it, but to perfect it, it takes time. And this has been shown in pigeons. Pigeons have been shown to be able to use the geomagnetic compass fairly well long before the solar compass becomes well developed. And you can do these experiments just simply by taking birds of different age and subjecting them to, you know, these tests where you're putting them in different places and seeing how accurately they can navigate home. So the big take-home point here, navigation is an integrated system. Birds are using lots of tools in order to get it right. And these tools do a pretty good job because birds can basically land right back on the same branch they were on last year, in spite of having traveled thousands of miles. And that is it for navigation. Questions? I'm not done yet. Your handouts are done, but I saved Michelle the trouble of reminding me that I didn't post the handout for this chapter yet, but I will have that done before the end of the day. All right, let's talk about social behavior. This is one of my funnest topics because we get to talk about territoriality, and I cut my teeth on hummingbirds studying territoriality. So, to reduce hostile interactions, birds need some personal space, okay? And the amount of individual space that a bird needs is going to be different for different species, and it's going to be different for birds who have different social needs. So there are some exceptions to this. If you have a real social species, and think back to the penguins, the huddling penguins we looked at a while back, a lot of times they just need to be really close to each other. Sometimes birds have some strong interactions with each other. Here are two birds that are engaged in what we call allopreening. One bird will preen the other. We'll be picking things off of it, fixing its feathers, and they kind of take turns, giving each other a feather dew. Huddling gets back to the penguins that we talked about. They huddle to keep warm, particularly at night. But the need for space, one of the things that makes this unique somewhat in birds is that it can, if the habitat is uniform, create a fairly uniform pattern of distribution among birds, which is not a normal pattern when you look across landscapes. Ecologically, it's not a normal pattern, and it's generally some sort of aggression between individuals that will make that work. And as I already said, the amount of space required by individual birds is going to vary between species. So territoriality is a form of aggressive spacing, and there are a lot of reasons why birds exhibit territoriality, and we'll talk about several of them. And territorial behaviors, quite frankly, are pretty difficult to categorize. One classic example, we've all enjoyed watching Anna's hummingbirds out there doing dive displays. The reason why they do the dive displays, a lot of people want to pigeonhole that into something that they do to females, but I studied this for my master's degree, and I've watched them dive over empty bushes. I watch them dive on other species. And so it clearly is a multi-purpose display. Okay, so in a classic old paper by Brown and Oriens back in 1970, they described territoriality as having three major components. The first is a territory is a fixed area defended continuously for some period of time. And that period of time can be short. Okay, basically the duration of defense probably is dictated by the duration which the resource is available. It can occur during breeding or non-breeding, although breeding territoriality will often look very different than non-breeding territoriality. And the location of a territory could change if the resource that is being defended moves, which is possible. 2, rival birds are discouraged from entering the territory, and the territory owner will enforce this by chasing rival birds or displaying to rival birds. Birds are really good at sending visual and verbal communication, which helps them to work out social dominance so that they don't actually have to fight. There are exceptions to this, but you often don't see birds really ripping each other up. Although, like I say, it's not that it never happens. So, and the primary or even exclusive use of the territory and its resources are generally limited to the territory owner who is defending the territory. And in some cases, the access could also be extended to mates and offspring. And I think we'll look at that movie We come back on Tuesday, since I'm pretty close to out of time here. Questions? Anything burning on your brains before I let you go? If not, everybody, if I don't see you before then, have a great weekend.